Hello everyone, I'm Tarfay, and here's my co-host, John Bosco.
Hey.
Today we will be interviewing one of the world's young climbing stars, Peak Marcello. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Okay then, let's get into the first question. What made you climb the skyscraper in New York City?
Well, it was when I was little we moved out of Wyoming where I was taught to climb and found a passion for it. My dad hadn't been home for a while, well, more like 2 days a year. One night, this man by the name of Rolf shows up at our doorstep because his car slid off the road. My mom, Terry, takes him in and realizes he's an old friend from college. Since then, Rolf had come to visit my mom and I. He would fly all the way from New York City to our cabin on the prairie where I would climb. After several months of Rolf visiting us, we came to New York City for a 2-week stay to visit him, and it was much different and louder than Wyoming. At the end of it, he announced he wanted to get married to my mom. She accepted his proposal and they got married. Although I did like Rolf, that did mean selling the cabin on the prairie where I would climb and moving to New York City. There was nowhere to climb except the 15-foot walls at the YMCA, which I could have done blindfolded, and climbing camps, which were only in the summer. After months of thinking and planning my way up the building, I attempted my amazing feat.
How did it feel?
Well, it felt very unnatural climbing a building made of glass and metal, but satisfying to be up high and climbing something challenging. I could feel the air getting thinner and the wind getting stronger and colder, but it felt like I was climbing the rock wall we had on the prairie, made of actual rock. It was rough at the end where I had a SWAT team on the roof waiting to arrest me and a helicopter hovering next to me with an officer screaming at me with a megaphone. Overall, it was worth it.
After not seeing your dad for years, what do you think of seeing him?
To be completely honest with you, I felt a little surprised he had even showed up in court to support me. Like I said earlier, Josh was only home for about 2 days a year. Then he went back to teaching seminars, classes, endorsing climbing equipment, and climbing mountains. Every day, even the day I was born, he wasn't there to see me. After the first time he saw me was 3 months later, Even though he did have some dark to him, I was happy to see my real father in person again.
How do you feel when he offered to take you to Nepal with him?
Well, when he offered to take me to Nepal with him, I was kind of shocked because I didn't know what it was for. Yes, I knew it was to get me out of trouble in New York for climbing the skyscraper, but moving into another country is a big deal. I had no idea what we were going to do in Nepal. Climb a mountain? That was my first guess, but I was still very confused.
Who did you attempt to climb the summit with?
I attempted the summit climb, with 4 friends of mine that I made on the mountain. There were 2 porters named Yogi and Yash. They're almost like Sherpas. And a Sherpa's son named Sun Joe, and I. My dad Josh stayed behind because he had a business to run to get other climbers to the summit.
Why did it take you attempt the summit with only 4 others?
That's because Captain Sheik, he was an army captain, had him out and crawling with Chinese military climbers that wanted to arrest us. Sun Zhou, who I climbed with, was from an oppressed country by China, and they didn't want someone from another country to be the youngest person to summit Everest.
What drove you to the summit of Everest, the world's highest peak?
Fame and endorsement mostly at first, but the thought of leaving my family back home without a son loomed in my head throughout the climb soon after I decided to reach the summit. I thought that if I finished the climb to the summit, that I would be nothing but selfish, but I was told by my mother, but I wasn't.
Did you realize anything when you got up to the summit?
When I got to the top of the mountain, I realized that everything was important to me was far below where I was now. When I say this, I'm talking about all the people that I left behind during the trip. My mom and my dad, Rolf, but most important, my 2 peas in a pod, my little sisters. But at the same time, I thought about Sunjo and his sisters, and how he was summoning the mountains so they could be schooled. I also remembered how Sunjo's father died to save my father's life on Annapurna. I owed him a favor, a big favor. Like I said, Sunjo is from an oppressed country, and he was doing this for the pride of his country and his family back home.
When did you make your summit attempt and where? Also, how long did it take you to get up there?
I made my summit attempt in the months of April through June. The year was 2017, and this was when the weather was right to summit Everest. You may think you can go anytime you want to reach the top, but most of the time the weather isn't good enough. Most of the time on Everest, the weather usually involves sub-zero temperatures, that's regular, blizzards, avalanches, and big windstorms with ice and wind speed over 100 miles an hour. Usually the windstorms are the worst, especially over the death zone. They call it that for a reason, because once over it, your bodies are slowly dying from the lack of oxygen and low energy. Take that and combine a storm with wind speeds over 100 miles an hour and freezing snow and ice being pelted at you. That's why I hate the attempt when I did.
How did the weather and equipment you were climbing with affect your climb?
The weather and equipment I was using affected my climb a lot. The technology that we were using was very important because things like the Gamoff bag saved climbers' lives while climbing Everest. We also had many tools to help us climb Everest, like titanium axes and many coils of rope that helped us hoist ourselves up the mountain. But I felt like the weather was a much bigger factor. It is so unpredictable, and you can get a feet of snow without even realizing. Also, the oxygen affects how your body reacts to things. So when it gets really cold and snowy at the highest altitude, you've been at affects your body, and that affects your body a lot and makes it hard to function. The thin air on the mountain makes it hard to breathe even more. We carry O's or oxygen tanks up the mountain to give us a boost in our step and movement. This is why people climb Everest This is why people climbing Everest have to acclimatize to get used to the thin air, or else you'll get hate. This is basically when your lungs fill with fluids in your body and you basically drown yourself to death.
Thank you for coming to the show, Peak.